You'll have seen in the news that Northern Rail is being nationalised. But what does that actually mean? Will it make services any better? And why didn't it have to be nationalised in the first place? I'm Chris Northwood and I really like trains. I'm not that interested in trains themselves. What I'm really interested in is complex systems like the railway network. And in complex systems, when things go wrong, the answer is rarely as simple. Nationalisation is normally defined as a government buying a company or asset from the private sector and putting it under state control. This has happened in the railway before. In 2002, the government spent £500 million buying Railtrack from private investors, renamed the company to Network Rail. Railtrack was a company that ran the infrastructure and the tracks of the railway network. But that's not what's happening here. The government isn't buying Northern Rail. To understand what is happening, we have to go back in time and look at how our privatised rail network even works. In 1992, the Conservative government under John Major was seeking re-election and included a pledge in its manifesto to nationalise the railways. That's something even Margaret Thatcher, queen of privatisation, considered too far. They won the election and started developing a plan. At one point, the idea was to try and privatise British Rail all as one big body, but in 1991, the EU passed a directive which meant that all EU member states had to separate the company that ran the tracks from the company that operated the trains. The idea was that would allow other companies to run trains and introduce competition into the network. So a plan was formed where the infrastructure, that is the rails, the signalling, the stations, was sold off. The companies which operated the freight on the British Rail network were sold off. But that wasn't considered appropriate for the companies that operated the passenger services on the British Rail network. So a system of franchising was formed. With a franchise, 25 long-running contracts were awarded to companies to actually run the services. These are the TOCs, the train operating companies. The trains themselves were actually sold to a different set of companies, the rolling stock companies or the ROSCOs. These ROSCOs would then lease the trains back to the TOCs, who would actually be able to run the services. In the north of England, two franchises were identified, Regional Railways North East and Regional Railways North West. These were awarded to two companies in 1997, Arriva Trains Northern and First North Western. Arriva Trains Northern running the north eastern side of the country, and First North Western, unsurprisingly, running the western side around Manchester and Lancashire and the Lake District. However, in the year 2000, the Strategic Rail Authority found that this system of having 25 franchises with quite long franchise periods was not really giving value for money. It proposed changing that, having shorter franchise periods and fewer franchises. So the northern franchises were kind of combined together but also split up again. There was going to be one franchise for all the regional and local rail services, which was the Northern franchise, and an intercity Northern franchise, which is called the Transpennine Express franchise. So when we say that Northern is being nationalised, we don't mean that the government is buying Arriva Rail North. What we do mean is that the franchise is being taken away from Arriva Rail North and being given to a new company called Northern Trains. And Northern Trains is owned by the government. So it's not Northern Trains that are being nationalised, it's the Northern franchise that's being nationalised. The service is being nationalised, not the company. So now let's have a look about how it all went wrong for Northern. The problems go back to when the Northern contract was first awarded in 2003 to a company called Serco-Abellio who ran Northern Rail. Now, this contract was awarded as what's called a no-growth contract. That means that the government did not expect that the number of rail passengers in the UK would increase. It guaranteed that if passenger numbers decreased, the company would be able to guarantee its income. It would kind of top it up. But it means if there was any passenger growth, the additional money would be given back to the government. Now, the problem is passenger numbers did grow. They grew by quite a lot. Over 20 million more passengers were travelling every year along the Northern network than they were at the start of the franchise. That's a growth of about a third. However, because if the company invested any money in trains because of the no growth contract, that just means they're eating into their own profit margin. The shorter franchises introduced another problem. The rolling stock companies would expect to be able to lease a train for at least 20 years in order to be able to make their money back on them. With the shorter franchises, there was no guarantee that a train they would buy today for a company that might only be around for a few years would necessarily be leased by another company in the future. This meant that the rolling stock companies were very unwilling to buy new trains unless the government promised to underwrite it. And when the government promised to underwrite it, The government then started to specify exactly what they wanted in the trains. Around 2010, the government started noticing that rail passenger numbers in the north of England were on the increase and started to figure out what to do with it. They knew that they couldn't continue with the no growth contract, so they started deciding what the type of rail franchise in the north of England should be. It took them so long to decide what to do, they had to extend the contract 3 times, the original 2011 expiry date of the franchise to 2016. So Northern Rail was operating the trains for longer than they expected and still under this no growth arrangement. The government also started looking at what they should do around rail infrastructure. If more people were using the trains, then the current rail infrastructure would not necessarily cope with that level of growth. So they came up with this idea called the Northern Hub. Now, the Northern Hub was a series of rail electrification and new track projects, mostly centred around Manchester, which is kind of in the centre of certainly the northwestern part of the network. The government also knew that new trains would be needed on the Northern network. Much of the Northern network runs using the type of train called the Pacer. The Pacer is a kind of bus that they put wheels onto. That is not a joke. That is actually what they did. They were built in the late 80s and they were only ever intended as a temporary fix. The government were also down in London investing significant amounts of money in Thameslink. Thameslink was a new project to connect North and South London, and brand new trains were being bought for Thameslink. With electrification on the cards in the north, that meant that we didn't actually have to buy any new trains to the north. The north could get the electric trains that the south were no longer going to be using because they were getting new trains. With electrification on the way and a surplus of electric trains coming from the south, the government didn't think that investing in any new trains to the north was necessary. However, many of the electrification projects ran late and several of them, some very important ones, got cancelled. The government also started getting involved in allocating which TOCs got which trains. In 2014, when electrification was still on the cards, the government decided that several of the diesel trains being used by TransPennine would be able to go down to Chiltern, who run services between Oxford and London. With the cancellation of the electrification programmes, there were now so many surplus electric trains and so few diesel trains needed to boost the northern diesel services that some of the old electric trains are having diesel generators fitted to them so they can work as electric trains from an onboard generator. Like the Pacers, these electric trains were built in the 80s, so even though they're a nicer train, they're still no newer. Not only were the trains ordered years later than they should have been to be needed, when they did eventually start to arrive, there were delays due to manufacturing flaws in bringing them into service. So this sets the backdrop for 2018. The government has let a contract based on a growth contract to this new company run by Arriva Rail North, the current operator of Northern. In 2018, in order to meet their contractual obligations to the government, they have to start running to a new timetable. The new timetable has been built based around the idea of the Northern Hub. Now, remember the electrification programme was cancelled. They weren't the only parts of the Northern Hub that got cancelled. A new curve was built in Manchester connecting Piccadilly and Victoria stations. Previously, trains going from Manchester Airport to Leeds had to enter Manchester Piccadilly station and then reverse out. On the way out, you had to cross every single line going into Piccadilly station in order to get to the junction that went to Leeds. This caused a major bottleneck. So a new line this new curve, the Ortal Chord, was built in order to let trains go round Manchester the other direction without having to reverse at Piccadilly. This was sending a lot more trains down what is called the Castlefield Corridor, from Piccadilly's 2 free platforms, through Oxford Road, through Deansgate, past Salford Central, and over to Victoria. The government knew there wasn't the capacity to send all the trains needed down the Castlefield Corridor and around the Ortal Chord, so it was proposed to build 2 additional platforms at Piccadilly to allow the trains to stop there. But these platforms were not built, but the timetable that was introduced assuming that the platforms were built came in. When the May 2018 timetable came in, chaos ensued. But things were still to get worse for Northern. So one of the requirements in the franchise agreement with the government was that Northern should introduce driver-operated doors as part of the contract, which means that the driver, not the conductor or the guard, is responsible for opening and closing the doors. Now, this was not a popular move with the unions, who saw this as a precursor to potentially removing conductors and guards from trains completely. They also made an argument about safety. They claimed that it was less safe for the driver to do it versus the conductor or the guard. This led to a fairly major series of strikes in the summer of 2018, and the relationship between the management and the staff and the unions have soured ever since. Northern have relied on the goodwill of their staff for a long time. They extensively rely on volunteer overtime, and Northern staff are quite lucky in that they do not have a contractual obligation to work on a Sunday, so all Sunday trains rely on overtime. With the relationship between the staff and the company and the management at such an all-time low, the amount of people coming forward to volunteer, to give up their Sundays, to volunteer to do overtime, were low. This led to mass cancellations at weekends due to staff shortages, and this kind of got worse towards the end of 2019, where there was also a requirement to get rid of all of the pacers by the 1st of January 2020. So with the trains being delivered late, there was a compressed schedule available for training the drivers to drive the new trains. So with staff unwilling to work overtime and more staff having to be taken out of their regular driving duties to do training on the new trains, there were mass cancellations and mass reliability issues. So public opinion really turned against Northern. With the infrastructure not there to be able to deliver the timetables, with the trains being delivered too late to really alleviate people's concerns they had around the quality of the trains they were using, and with staff shortages left, right and centre, cancellation and reliability of Northern trains really plummeted. But none of that is the reason why Northern had the contract taken away from them. The government didn't really care that Northern were not delivering on the promises of the contract. The reason the government had taken the franchise away from Northern was because of financial reasons. Now, one of the hopes of the growth contract that was awarded to Arriva was that the government would be able to reduce the amount of subsidy that they have to spend on Northern. So at the start of the contract, the government agreed to spend £275 million a year, subsidising Northern in order to be able to make sure it can run all of its train services, including the unprofitable ones, say the middle of the day on a fairly unused branch line. By the end of the franchise, the aim was to be able to reduce that subsidy down to £34 million. That's a fairly significant drop. It would basically require Northern to make £230 million a year more from the passengers. It could do this through cost-cutting exercises, or it's actually limited in the amount of fares it can raise themselves because the fares are set by government. It could eat it into the profit margin, but Arriva were making a profit. They were made £11 million last year, but it's not enough to be able to absorb the reduction in costs of that amount. So it's looking likely that Northern would just simply run out of money during 2020, and that is why the government took the contract off them. So what does a new contract hold? Well, the government probably aren't going to go bust. They'll be able to continue running the trains, but a lot of those other issues that we talked about, the problem with the new trains coming along, the infrastructure delays, they're not going to go away anytime soon. The one hope is that the new management, who are going to come in with the government-operated company, might be able to improve the industrial relations between the staff and the unions and the management. We might be able to get new volunteers to do Sunday working again. The government operator have also said they're going to clean the trains more frequently, which is nice, but it's not ultimately going to improve the reliability of the service. There isn't an easy answer to Northern's problems. Time is definitely going to help. Getting the new trains in service, the infrastructure improvements that are still considering once they're completed will also make a difference. But nationalisation by itself isn't something going to make a huge difference. It's not going to make a big difference whether it's a private company or the government having these problems, because the problems are still going to exist regardless. Of course, this isn't the end of the story. Northern aren't the only operator in this situation. TransPennine are also looking like they're going to have financial difficulties in the year ahead. South Western Trains in the south of the UK also looks like they have some serious difficulties. So just nationalising those operators also aren't going to solve the problem. The problem is much deeper. It's the way privatisation was done. It's the way the system has been structured with the franchise model. That's what's broken about our railways. And regardless of who operates those franchises, whether it is a public sector organisation or the private sector, it's that structure that's broken, and it's the structure needs fixing. Nationalisation by itself does not fix anything. Nationalisation, if combined with structural change, could fix it, but structural change by itself would also fix it. Nationalisation is a bit of a red herring. What you really need to have in the railway is structural change of the franchising system. Thanks for watching, and I hope you've enjoyed this video and learned something from it. I'm going to be making a series of videos exploring the complexity and nuance of our railway network, looking at topics such as high speed 2 and nationalisation and privatisation more generally. If you've got any feedback, please feel free to comment, or you can also find me on Twitter. I'm just C Northwood. And please like and subscribe to be notified of the further videos I'm doing. Thank you very much.